Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms from Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm your host, Lisa Edwards, and today I'm joined by Lauren Caplan, who's Managing Director at the Leadership Now Project. Lauren, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Great. Well, so today we're going to be talking about mitigating political risk, and in particular, leading up to the U.S. presidential election. There's always uncertainty around elections. We know that. And, most companies already do think about the relevant regulatory uncertainty, if X, then this, if Y, then that. But most of us on U.S. boards have not really had to deal with some of the political factors that we sometimes see in other countries. Political risk has started to appear on the enterprise risk matrix for a lot of companies this year. What makes the political climate risk different this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, most of us are more accustomed to thinking about political risks sort of outside of the United States and have systems and processes in place for thinking about that. And certainly regulatory risk within the US in terms of, the potential for regulations that are more or less beneficial to shift and how to strategize for that. But what we don't typically think about is how, those political risks that relate to the political institutions themselves. And so meaning, will the processes that we rely on in terms of how the regulations are made, how they're changed, how they're applied, we don't typically worry about whether those processes will hold up. And that's what's shifting now. And that's so important because we know that stability and predictability are so important for and fundamental to why the environment in the United States for so long has been a good one to operate in for businesses overall, and has really encouraged competition and innovation and, the creation of value for all of us. And so that's sort of the shift that we're seeing. And as the political instability in the United States increases, like you said, we're seeing this topic and how to think about political risk specifically within the United States move up the agenda for boards, move up in terms of priority for, for C-suite executives. And that's with good reason, because there's a lot of data to back up what we sort of feel intuitively has been happening. So, everything from the Economist Intelligence Unit puts out a democracy index, and they had downgraded the United States from a full to a flawed democracy several years ago. We have not improved from that situation, and that's largely based on the health of political institutions. We see those risks reflected in credit ratings. So we've seen Fitch and Moody's downgrade the United States, partly based on this concern around political institutions and polarization. And then Leadership Now itself has, we have our democracy report cards. And so we go through and rate states based on the health of their political institutions. And right now there's about 25 states that score a C or a D on that. So there are real, we're seeing real shifts. And as is clear, businesses are sort of caught in the middle, right? Of all of this being pushed and pulled from various stakeholders, as well as political leaders, in terms of being asked to take on weigh in on a much broader range of issues, and having to deal with things that they haven't had to before. So, specifically what it looks like now, just I'll try to wrap up, but is companies right now having to think about political violence, depending where their companies are based or their customers are, and whether they're going to have issues around employee safety or customer safety or supply chain disruption. And we're also seeing a lot of resources and energy being put into employee polarization, and companies, depending, again, where they're based, having to deal with, challenges around retaining and attracting talent, and also just how to deal with employee polarization itself. So there have been articles almost every day about different strategies companies are trying to address that. But certainly there are things right now that companies are having to deal with.
Well, and you yourself, I think, put out a guide, right? So you recently published the corporate guide for navigating U.S. political risk. And I think, honestly, most boards, generally speaking, they try to stay out of politics. But, that doesn't mean that they should turn a blind eye to some of these potential risks. So, give us some tips here. What are some of the key actions from your report that can guide boards and companies now to mitigate the impact of political risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like we've been talking about, for all the reasons that we just went over, decisions are not always straightforward about political activities, and are often complicated and can be difficult to navigate. And so we put together a number of tools just to try to help specifically for U.S. political risk and how to think about it. One of those is a political risk analysis that really tries to link political risks to the impacts on the ground for businesses. And then the other is a corporate guide that has step-by-step tools for boards, for management, and for investors around specific action steps that they can take and links to resources that may be helpful. Lots of our partners have a lot of wonderful resources out there. So we try to capture those in one place. And I think the idea, like you said, is a lot of companies have pieces or parts of this in place already, or parallel processes in place already that they can choose from. And so the idea of the guide is for users to pick and choose the parts that are relevant to them and use it just as kind of a check also on what they may be already doing. But in terms of actions to take now, for boards in particular, as we've been talking about, it's clear that political risks in the US are material to business. And so that means that it really is part of a board's fiduciary duty to provide oversight around political activities of a company. But we know that currently the percentage of corporate boards that are really considering US political risk in their decision making is quite low. And so we provide a checklist for boards that really outlines key questions they should be able to answer, provides a roadmap for information that they can ask management for, and identifies the types of questions that should probably rise to the board level in terms of decision making. And, a couple of places for boards to focus are really making sure they understand clearly what political activities the company is currently engaged in. And I think we think when we say political activities, we're using a pretty broad definition. So we're talking about everything from lobbying to just external statements to certainly political spending. And so making sure that as a starting point, as a board, you understand the full range of political activities that the company is engaged in, and making sure that the information isn't just coming from one internal group. Sometimes this activity, right, gets siloed in government affairs, but as we see, these risks really span over almost all groups internally in terms of having an impact and needing to weigh in. So you want to make sure that you understand how the company is managing those risks and have a comprehensive process in place for mapping the risks. A couple other quick things. One thing companies may want to think of on the management side is whether it makes sense to define red lines ahead of time. So again, sometimes it can be helpful to think about things before they happen and decide whether the company is how they might react. So one clear one that we've seen in the past is political violence again, and threats to election workers as an issue that some companies have chosen. If that happens where we're based, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and kind of knowing that ahead of time can be helpful.
Yeah, I think a lot of boards have also, and companies have at least started to get a little bit of experience in that area, given sort of a lot of the nature of the last, 5 years or so prior to that have been, what just cultural issues do you engage in? What do you choose to weigh in the news and the press? And that's, there's been an evolution there where, employees sort of have come to expect more than companies historically have done. So I think there is a motion and a mechanism for that in some companies now, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes sense. And I think the idea really is just that all of this is really part of just your basic risk management at this point, given the current context.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the check boxes because we like a good checklist. I want to dig into one of the things that you said that, I think we should sort of double click on, which was you mentioned investors. And we know that institutional investors are increasingly concerned about political risk. What are the questions that boards should be able to answer for those institutional investors when they ask?
Yeah, like you said, investors are increasingly focused on this area. And, one of the unique things is, right, for most investors, they're not just going to allocate away from the United States as a way to deal with it. And so that really means that, we're seeing increasing engagement, right, as a way of addressing their concerns. The United the States United, survey earlier this year. They did a survey of institutional investors that represented about $10 trillion in assets under management. And a strong majority of those investors believe that threats to democracy in the United States is increasing. But at the same time, less than a third of those investors felt confident that public companies were equipped to manage that risk. And so, that's just contributing to kind of where the thinking is right now and from institutional investors. And one thing to keep in mind, too, is that those investors themselves are under scrutiny, right? We've seen a lot of pressure on institutional investors over the past year to 2 years around their own political activities and, themselves being subject to political retribution and pressure from their own stakeholders, whether it's, pension beneficiaries or students benefiting from endowments. So they sort of have two layers of pressure. So the questions that boards and companies should expect from investors are really questions around the processes that we've laid out. So, right, does the company have a political activity policy in place? What is the board's oversight role? Which activities require board approval? How often is the board reviewing those political activities? In particular, is the company thinking about potential misalignments? So, where a political activity or, say a political donation maybe conflicts with a public commitment the company has made on a different issue, and how is the company reconciling that situation? Investors will want to understand what the decision-making process is there. Again, understanding that you don't need to agree with every decision that a company makes, but having that process in place where the decisions are being made in the same way is something that investors are going to be looking for. And certainly transparency, right? Investors, we've seen a number of proxy proposals around this, just as in other spaces, in terms of investors really looking to make sure that companies are disclosing as much information as they can about their political activities, allowing investors to be able to ask the questions that they want to ask. So I think those are some of the things investors are looking for.
Yeah, that's great. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have. Thank you, Lauren, for really a rundown on an interesting, pressing topic. For those of you who are interested in digging in deeper, we'll link the report in the show notes, or you can just search for the Leadership Now project on Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever the heck it is you use, and you will find it there. Thank you for listening, and we will see you on our next episode.